Well, good afternoon. This week I stopped by and saw Father Dominic, and he kind of apologized to me a little bit. He said, I've given you two very tough preaching assignments. I had you preaching on 9/11, and now I have you preaching the weekend before the election. And as I was reflecting on it, I was wondering whether he was thinking that the election's going to be a disaster on the level of 9/11. But I'm not going to preach on the election other than to say that Bishop McElroy this week came out with some very simple directives about how to vote. And he said, when you're voting, you need to vote for candidates that are going to advance the common good. And so he said, study the issues seriously and then vote your conscience. He said, you want to act as if Jesus is right there with you in the election booth, looking over your shoulder to see who you're voting for. So do that and your vote will be fine. So I decided not to talk about the election too much, but I'd like to preach on something simpler, martyrdom. So in the first reading this morning, we have the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, and they are classic martyrs. They are tortured and killed because, as it says, they would rather die than transgress the laws of our ancestors. They would rather die than transgress the laws of the King of the world. And so they remain faithful to God and to God's laws. And a result of that, they are killed, they are martyred. And yet they express the hope that they will be resurrected, that they will live on. The notion of martyrdom runs very deep in our Catholic tradition. We talk about the martyrs of the early church. And one of my favorite series of martyrs are the Deacon martyrs. You know, we don't hear enough about deacons in the church these days. So Pope Sixtus had 5 deacons, and they were all going to be martyred. This is in the 3rd century. But the deacon Lawrence was the money man. So the Romans martyred Pope Sixtus and 4 deacons, but they let Lawrence live. And they told him, tomorrow, he was in charge of finance, he said, so we want you to gather the treasures of the church, bring them all tomorrow, and it will save your life. So that night, Deacon Lawrence went out, and he took the money that he had, and he distributed among all the poor, got rid of all the church's money. The next day, he came to the Roman officials, and he brought with him the poor, the lame, the elderly, the halt, all of those that were outcast. And he said to the Roman official, here are the treasures of the church. He was martyred shortly after that. Martyrdom runs deep, but what does it mean to be a modern martyr? We hear a lot about it in the news. We had recently the priest that was killed while saying Mass in France. We see the many martyrs in the Middle East. We've had martyrs in our own lifetime, like the 4 church women in El Salvador, or the Jesuits and their housekeepers in San Salvador as well. But what is it to be a martyr in the modern world? What is it to be a martyr? I want to briefly reflect on 3 individuals who I claim to be martyrs. Dr. King, who some people might object to that, Oscar Romero, Archbishop of San Salvador, and James Foley, a journalist. But before I get there, while I was growing up, we were always told about the martyrs. 2 of the martyrs that made a profound impact on me were the Jesuit martyrs who came and worked among the native peoples in upstate New York and in Canada, Isaac Jogues and Jean Brebeuf. Well, Isaac Jogues, in particular, worked among the Hurons, and he was captured by the Iroquois, the enemy of the Hurons, and he was tortured, and he lived as a year as a servant in very difficult circumstances. Well, finally, he was rescued and released, and he returned to France. But after a brief time, he decided, I want to go back to my people in the New World. So he came back to work among the Hurons. This time, he would be killed with a hatchet blow to the head, and so he became a martyr. But recently, there's been a number of Native Americans who challenge the fact of whether Jogues was a martyr or not. They say, Jogues wasn't really a martyr. We didn't kill him because he was spreading the faith. We killed him because he was an annoying intruder. It is not religion that's the issue here. But as I reflected on this, I think that this kind of misses the point about what a martyr is. The question with the martyr isn't how the martyr dies. The question is how the martyr lived. In fact, the way a person lived is oftentimes what leads him to become a martyr. Jogues could have stayed in France. He could have stayed and enjoyed a good life. But he didn't. He came back to preach the good news to these people that he felt needed to hear this message. The important fact of martyrdom is not how the person dies, but how the person lived. As Jesus says, our God is not a God of the dead, but our God is a God of the living. Dr. King was a martyr, not because of his death on that dreary afternoon outside the Lorraine Motel. Dr. King was a martyr because he abandoned the comfortable life of a Baptist preacher and daily put his life on the line for the dignity of his people, in fact, for the dignity of all people. There's a wonderful story he told during the Montgomery bus boycott. There was an evening where he was feeling kind of depressed. He just received a very nasty phone call, and the person told him that if he didn't leave town, he was going to blow up his house. So he went down into the kitchen, and he began to pray. And he prayed, Lord, I'm feeling very weak and discouraged, and I don't know what to do. I don't want the people to see me like this. And as he prayed, he said he began to hear a voice, and the voice said to him, Martin Luther King, stand up for justice. Martin Luther King, stand up for righteousness. Martin Luther King, stand up for justice. And lo, I will be with you always, even till the end of the age. And King said he knew that it was the voice of Jesus, and that voice of Jesus told him he will be with him always. And from that point on, he always felt this comfort that what he was doing was the work of Jesus. King's martyrdom began by accepting the Lord's call to service, by accepting the simple dictum, not my will, but thine be done. Archbishop Romero was a martyr not because he was assassinated by a sniper's bullet while celebrating Mass in the Divina Providencia Hospital in San Salvador. He became a martyr because he took seriously the Sermon on the Mount. He became a martyr because he took seriously the injunction to be on the side of the poor, to serve the poor. And in so doing, he became subversive and dangerous to the powerful and to those that upheld the status quo. Even so, like the Maccabees, Romero proclaimed, if they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador. James Foley was a journalist who worked in the Middle East, and he had gone to Syria in 2012, and he began to tell the stories of what was happening there. He would be captured by ISIS and ultimately would be beheaded in 2014. Immediately, he was celebrated as a martyr. People put forth his life and what a good life he had led. But then rumors began to come out that before he had died, he may have renounced the faith and he may have pledged allegiance to Allah. Well, the editor for America magazine, Kevin Clark, wrote this reflection on James Foley. He said, whatever the faith the unfortunate James Foley professed in the end, in his life he remained true to a central commitment which grew out of his Catholic upbringing, to be a voice for the voiceless, to tell the stories of the ignored, to hear the wisdom that emerges only among those who have truly suffered and who know the value of life, because death has come to surround them with such fury and capriciousness. Whether James Foley died a Catholic martyr or not, he died committed to his vocation as a journalist, offering up his life on behalf of people whose grim fates were being grimly ignored, and which still are ignored. Challenging that indifference drove James Foley to his lonely appointment in Syria. Who am I to say such a man is not a martyr? Indeed, we are all called to be martyrs, which in the original Greek meant simply witnesses. We are all called to follow the crucified one. We're all called to daily die to self in 1,000 different ways, to place ourselves on the sides of the poor, the outcast, the disenfranchised, the sorrowing, the suffering. And in so doing, we may place our own physical lives at risk. We do not regard the risk with dread or apprehension, but we embrace it, assured of the love and faithfulness of our God, who assures us of our ultimate triumph. As St. Paul assures us that Jesus and God the Father love us and will encourage our hearts and strengthen them in every good deed and word. The Lord is faithful. He will strengthen you and guard you from the evil one. And like the Maccabees, Jesus affirms the reality of the resurrection. Death is not the final word. He tells us that the dead will rise, even Moses made known, when he called out, Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For to him all are alive. Amen.